questions?
All right, let's talk about registration and proof of residence. Because as I said before, registration is still very important. Voter registration is very important. It's one of the ways that a person can really be shut out of the process. If you show up on election day and you're not registered to vote and you don't have the proof of residence that you need in order to register on election day, that is one of the situations where you don't get to vote a provisional ballot. There's no alternative. You simply end up going home without being able to vote. So registration is very important. Unfortunately, it does require the voter to be thinking ahead about the process of doing voter registration, getting themselves registered. If they wait till election day, we still do have election day registration, but there are some additional rules on that. So, as I mentioned before, there have been some changes to registration, most notably the lack of a corroborator, as I mentioned before. Now, everybody who has to show up on election day, or I should say everyone who is going to be showing up on election day or in person in the clerk's office that needs to show a proof of residence, they need to show a document. And we'll talk about when proof of residence is required. We'll talk about what this document is, a proof of residence. But now everybody's going to have to show something. The other change, and I talked about this before, but I want to make sure that everyone knows it, is that Saturday, Sunday, and Monday is now closed for registration. It typically happens, and I'm as guilty of this as everyone else, is that we all procrastinate and we put off registering or put off filling out paperwork. And now, because we have closed registration that Saturday, Sunday, and Monday before the election, if someone waits until the last minute, they may not be able to register on those days. They still, again, have the opportunity on election day. But say you wanted to vote an absentee ballot in the clerk's office, you need to know that Friday is now your cutoff. There's no opportunities the weekend or the Monday before. So the voter registration process, we still like to think we have a very open system here in Wisconsin. We've got four methods by which you can register to vote, and they really break down by time period, when you're choosing to register. If you're registering to vote, you can always go to the JATV website or to your local municipal or county clerk's website, download a form off their website, print it off, fill it out, and send it in through the mail. That's always an option. You can also register with the special registration deputy that we talked about. Both by mail and special registration deputy registrations happen earlier than 3 weeks before the election. When we get to the third week before the election, specifically the third Wednesday before the election, we have a process called closed registration that occurs at that 20th day before the election. And at that point, our options narrow down. At that point, you can register in the municipal clerk's office, or you still have the option on election day to vote to register on election day at the polling place. Now, I should mention, you can register in your clerk's office any other time of the year, except for, again, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. But the municipal clerk's office is the only option between that 20th day before the election and that Friday before the election. That's the only place you can go. And that's to give our clerks more of an opportunity to put their poll books in order. It used to be that, and like I said, a lot of people procrastinate, they'd see a dramatic surge in voter registration the weekend before the election. People would come in, they'd register, and perhaps vote absentee ballots on that Saturday and Sunday and Monday. And that put a lot of pressure on a lot of our local clerks who were trying to print their poll books and make sure that they had up-to-date poll books ready to go on the Tuesday of the election. By closing off registration the Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, the goal is to give our clerks ample opportunity to make sure that all voter registrations are received, be it through the mail or whatever other process, make sure that they are processed and that everyone shows up on the poll book on election day. Now, the proof of residence has changed, and I want to direct your attention to page 36 for the list of proof of residence, as well as a list of when proof of residence is required, because it's not always required. As a matter of fact, proof of residence is really more the exception than the rule. There are only 3 times or 3 scenarios in which a person has to provide proof of where they live. A first-time registrant to Wisconsin, so you've never voted in our elections before, if you register by mail. If you register by mail and you're a first-time registrant, you do need to provide a copy of proof of residence with your registration. The second time you may have to provide proof of residence, or the second scenario, is if you're registering in the clerk's office in that 20-day period before the election. The thought here is that in the 20 days before the election, we don't have time to run our standard checks that we might use, such as the voter verification postcard, which is something that most voters will receive upon registering to vote. They'll get a mailed confirmation saying, you have registered to vote, here's your polling place, and this is a list of your districts that you vote in, so everyone knows who they're voting for. In the 3 weeks before the election, there's just not enough time to get those postcards mailed and to get them back as undeliverable if there was a mistake. So we provide proof of residence to our clerks in that 3-week period before Election Day. You register in the clerk's office beyond that, though, proof of residence is not required. So it's just that last window right before the election. And then finally, for the same reason, registering at the polls on Election Day, there's no opportunity for us to verify your residency. So we we require that people provide proof of their residency when they register to vote on Election Day. And this has always been, and probably will continue to be since it's been available, the most common form of registration. Be it procrastination or what have you, people like registering and voting all at once at the polling place on Election Day. So our list of proof of residence here on page 36 is largely the same as it's always been. Just a couple things to point out is that you see here on this list some of the things that Katie was already talking about with proof of identification. For example, your driver's license or your identification card. Now, when Katie's talking about it in the context of proof of identification, address doesn't matter. All we care about is that the person presenting the card is the person on the poll list, that we've matched the picture and that the name conforms. But when we're using it for proof of residence, that's when we need a current address, because now you are using it to prove that you live where you say you live. But just keep those two thoughts separate in your mind. There's proof of residence that you would use for voter registration, and there's proof of identification that you use to get your ballot. And while you may be able to use the same document, it's not the same thing. And there are times when it'll count for one thing and not the other. Another thing I want to point out is the utility bills and bank statements. We get the question all the time, well, I don't get those in the mail anymore. Can I use an electronic statement? And the answer is yes, you can. Print out an electronic statement is perfectly valid. The only thing we don't allow is you can't show it to us on your phone or on your iPad or something like that. We had a brief flirtation with that, and now we've decided that it has to be a physical form that you're showing us, a copy of that printed out online statement. Even though we don't have corroboration anymore, there still is an option that is very flexible and may help many individuals who lack traditional proof of residence, and that's a check or other document issued by a unit of government. That's a very broad category. It can cover things like licenses or registrations you may have from government. I've gotten a number of questions about what documents could potentially fit in here, and the definition is, as it says here, any other document issued by a unit of government. The only thing that we've really tried to draw the line on is that it should be some sort of official communication to the person. For example, a mailing from the university that says to it's an advertisement to buy tickets for something, an athletic event or a show. That doesn't probably qualify as a document from a unit of government. We're looking for something that's more specifically addressed to an individual, like a letter or something else that's directly addressing a particular person. Advertisements we're a little more leery of. Also, we do have an option here for our homeless voters, and we'll talk about homeless voters towards the end of the presentation. But we have a proof of residence that the Government Accountability Board has specifically carved out where we allow an affidavit on public or private social service agency letterhead to identify a homeless voter. As the homeless traditionally won't have those documents that we're looking for, like utility bills and bank statements, we provide that if a social service agency is willing to provide that identification on their letterhead, identify the individual much like you would see on a driver's license, give us hair color, weight, approximate weight, age, things like that. We'll accept that as a form of proof of residence. And then the last one is residential lease, and the key here is that it is not valid by mail. And that's one of those things that I can't answer. Why is it not valid if provided by mail? I don't know. That's just the way the law reads. So that everyone's aware, though, that that's the one exception there. Now, as I mentioned, we want to keep these ideas separate. We've talked about them, and I don't want people to get confused. We're talking about two different things. Proof of residence proves your address. It shows that you live where you say you live. Proof of identification proves you are who you say you are. They come up at two different times. Proof of residence is at registration. Proof of identification is when you're receiving your ballot. And that some documents will prove both. Any questions on registration or proof of residence?
I have a question about the homeless. And if on a letterhead from a service agency, how do you know whether they should vote in Ward 1 or Ward 2 or which parliamentary district, because they don't have an address? They only have the address of the service agency.
Mm-hmm. The question, just to repeat it, is what do you do with this letter that proves residence for a homeless voter? How do you know which ward they're in, what district? When I asked for this letter identifying them, we also asked in that letter that they identify a specific physical location. It can be a park bench, it can be a parking lot, it can be under a tree in a park. Those are all valid physical locations, but the key is that they have to be stationary. We have to be able to put a pin in the map somewhere and say that's where that person lives. They don't necessarily have to be able to receive mail there, but we have to know that that's where they live so that we can determine what ward they're in. That is just for voter registration.
Voter registration. That doesn't mean they'll have a photo ID to actually vote.
Yeah, we'll talk more about the homeless later on. And if you're interested in registering the homeless, come talk to us after the presentation. There are some procedures that we would ask people to follow if they're going to try and do voter registration with the homeless. Yes, ma'am?
For the voter registration, mail-in registration, do you have to have the original documents for your proof of residency, or can you use your photocopies?
Photocopy is acceptable because specifically if you're mailing in a voter registration, you want to mail in your proof of residence, and we don't want your driver's license. We want you to keep that so you can drive. You should make a photocopy and put it in the envelope.
So the mail-in registration closes 20 days before the election. So that means that someone would not only have to mail it in, but it would have to be processed before then. So, or if they mailed it and was delayed in the mail, it showed up Thursday, it would still be processed.
Thanks for the question. I should have clarified that. It has to be postmarked by that 20th day before the election. So we like to give the postal system a little bit more time than hopefully it needs. And as long as it's postmarked by that 20th day, it is acceptable. Yep. All right, if there are any other questions, let's talk a little bit about voting on election day itself. As I mentioned before, we've got a 3-step process now. It used to be just one, and that's our first step. State your name and address. That's always been required, or I should say it was required before the photo ID law. That is not a new requirement. And that is simply to provide everyone in the polling place an opportunity to hear who's voting and have the opportunity to object. So you say, I'm David Brueger and I live at 123 Main Street. And someone who's there, be it a poll worker or an election official or someone else who's just there to vote, can say, no, I know David, and that's not David. And they have the opportunity to challenge that person's vote, either on the basis of their identity or I should say going to their qualifications to vote or to their residency, things of that nature. That's where we have that opportunity, and it's to preserve that public aspect of the process. You don't get to vote privately. You do have to publicly announce who you are. Your vote is private, but the fact that you voted is public. The second thing we have to do now is show that acceptable photo ID that Katie talked about, all the different forms that you can use, but you do have to show that ID. Again, if you're mailing something in, if it's coming with your absentee ballot, for example, and Katie will talk about that in a moment, we want a copy of the photo ID. But if you're showing up in person, you're simply going to show that ID to the election official. And they'll have that opportunity then to see that your picture reasonably resembles and that your name conforms to what's on the poll list. Then the last thing we have you do is sign the poll book. And it's important to know that while you are required to sign the poll book, there is an exemption available for people with physical disabilities that would prevent them from signing. If you've got some sort of dexterity impairment or other physical disability that would prevent you from signing, simply tell your poll workers that you have a disability. You don't have to go into detail about what it is. We don't need a medical history. Simply indicate that you are prevented from signing due to physical disability, and your poll workers can write exempt on the signature line to indicate that you requested that exemption. So we get the question, what if I don't have an ID on election day? Well, the important thing to know is that you shouldn't leave without voting. A provisional ballot is an option for all voters, even if they don't have a proof of identification. Be it you physically don't have one, there's not one issued to you yet, or you simply left it at home. In either case, you can vote a provisional ballot. Your election officials should know this when you show up on election day, so if you say you don't have a proof of identification, they should offer you the opportunity to vote a provisional ballot. Some things you should know, though, about the process. You are going to vote a ballot that's going to be marked. It's marked so that after election day, we can piece it back together again, but when you provide your identification or whatever missing piece of documentation we were looking for, that we can then find the correct ballot and make sure that that is the one that is counted. Also, your vote, when you cast it at the polling place, only goes into an envelope. It doesn't go into the ballot box. It's not counted yet. We give you until the Friday following the election at 4 p.m. to provide your proof of identification or whatever else it was that caused that provisional ballot to be issued. You have until 4 p.m. to provide that, and once you provide that, then your ballot is counted. And a voter will know this because when they come into the polling place and vote a provisional ballot, they will vote the provisional ballot and they will seal it up in their envelope so that no one sees how they voted. They'll give that envelope to the chief election official in the polling place, and that election official is going to give them a receipt. We call it a provisional voting information sheet, and it's got all the information required for them to complete the process. It'll explain what was missing, that their vote has not been counted until they provide that missing documentation, and it'll have contact information for the local municipal clerk, informing them of the location and hours and any other methods of communication, be it phone, fax, or email, that they may be able to provide this information through. And the voter leaves with that receipt knowing that they have another step to complete in the process. They have not yet voted. The last thing we want to say about election day voting is to please be nice to the poll workers. I don't mean to make this in jest, although the smiley face adds an element of humor. What we have here is rapidly changing election laws. In my time with the Government Accountability Board and the Elections Board, I don't think I can remember an election where we've had the exact same rulings for the same election, for consecutive elections. They've changed generally between seasons. And poll workers, for the most part, are only working 2 to 4 times a year. They receive training from their local municipal clerk, and we definitely are proud of the training our local municipal clerks give, but the point is that our poll workers have very limited experience with this. Katie and I work with this on a regular basis year-round, and we have a hard time figuring this stuff out. For poll workers to try to absorb this in a training session that may only be a few hours, if that, it's difficult. And the key point to remember as well is they didn't write the law. They don't know the reasoning behind the law. They can't change the law. So while you may want to voice your opinion about the law and maybe your dissatisfaction or what have you, that's all well and good, but it's your legislator that can affect change on these issues. Your poll worker is simply trying to help you be able to vote a ballot.